Hello, my name is Nerida Campbell and I'm the Acting Head of Curatorial at Sydney Living Museums. Welcome to the 8th of our Discover SLM talks, and I particularly extend a warm welcome to our members, donors and supporters. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I live and currently work. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Curators at SLM are constantly discovering new stories about the people, places and things we care for at our 12 sites. During this talk series, we'll be sharing some of this research with you as we explore a range of subjects, from food to furnishing textiles, from celebrity marriages to colonial bungalows. Join me every Tuesday at the new time of 4 till 4:30 to hear our curators delve into a new topic. Today's speaker, Jane Kelso, historian with Sydney Living Museums, has had a lifelong fascination with the connections between people and places and a desire to burrow into archives and libraries to piece together the stories of our past. With degrees in social history, she has worked on a diverse range of publications, exhibitions, interpretive and conservation projects across the organisation. These have included co-curating the major India-China-Australia Trade and Society exhibition and curating Citizen Soldiers, the New South Wales Volunteer Rifles, and the First Government House display at the Museum of Sydney on the site of First Government House. She also researched and wrote the very complex history of the Justice and Police Museum site and has been working on the more recent history of Elizabeth Farm. Jane is passionate about helping people understand and appreciate our sometimes grimy, often quirky, but always illuminating and ongoing history. Now, if you have any questions for Jane about her talk, add it to the Zoom chat and she'll answer it at the end of this talk. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Nerida, and hopefully I'm about to share my screen with you. I should explain that rather awkward title comes from an article I wrote last year when masks were compulsory, which is now available on our website. I almost feel like I should apologise for it still being so topical. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 19 killed at least 50 million people. Some estimates put it as high as 100 million. Australia's isolation in the days before air travel would only hold it at bay for so long. When it arrived, it affected every aspect of life. The pandemic came in progressively more lethal waves. Regulations were relaxed as it waned, only to be brought in again or tightened. And there are many parallels with today, from community action and tension between states, to measures familiar today and then, as now, which were met with some resistance and opinions varied as to their effectiveness. These included mask wearing, restrictions on public gatherings, good hygiene such as hand washing, and what we now refer to as contact tracing, social distancing, and self-isolation. We knew how bad the pandemic was from overseas. New Zealand, for example, had been particularly badly hit. Influenza first appeared at the quarantine station at North Head in Manly in late October 1918. But strict maritime quarantine brought us valuable time to prepare, including manufacturing a vaccine, establishing public inoculation depots, and putting other plans into place, such as making provisions for emergency hospitals, including a 500-bed one at Randwick Racecourse. However, there was a shortage of doctors and nurses, with many not yet returned from war service overseas. Despite optimism that the quarantine barrier was holding, it could only last for so long, and the first cases were reported in Sydney in late January 1919. A returned soldier who had arrived from Melbourne was admitted to the military hospital at Randwick. On the 27th of January, New South Wales was declared infected and proclaimed a quarantine area. The following day, the states issued the first of many proclamations, closing libraries, schools, churches, theatres, picture shows and other entertainment venues in the Metropolitan Police District. Restrictions were progressively widened. Pubs and racecourses were closed and public gatherings banned. Conditions were imposed on travel outside Sydney as the disease spread. Now, an agreement had been made that when a state detected influenza, they would notify the Commonwealth, who would take control of border traffic, including providing what we now call a border bubble. However, by the time Victoria was declared infected, there was 350 infections in that state, and the virus had already spread. Tension surfaced as the other states viewed Victoria's delay in confirming the outbreak as a breach of the agreement, and it fell apart. Soon each state made their own arrangements. State borders were closed and quarantine camps were established. Queensland closed its southern border to everyone, even people living inside the 10-mile buffer zone, and people were stranded. Around 700 people ended up in a temporary quarantine camp on the Tenterfield Showgrounds, and new camps were soon established along the border at Coolangatta and Wollongara. Experiences in these camps varied. Although several days of steady rain in early March made life unpleasant, and there were frequent complaints of stale food, people also enjoyed concerts and the camp journal, called a tissue. South Australians outside this state also found the gates had closed behind them. Eventually, several hundred travellers were transported on guarded trains back to Adelaide and sent to a quarantine camp set up on the Jubilee Oval. Here too, life also had its joys. Cricket, afternoon tea parties, concerts. To many, it became known later as the Great Picnic. However, as you can see of these young men sleeping in the grandstand, not all accommodation there was so luxurious. This photograph shows on the right the Water Police Court, now the Justice and Police Museum, with the court keeper's cottage beyond, and then the Department of Public Health, which played a central role in managing the pandemic. Police had long played a role in public health management during epidemics, enforcing quarantine restrictions and health regulations, but given its location, the Water Police complex itself was also pressed into service during emergencies. This is a much earlier photograph, but it gives you a good idea of the location. That's the roof of the Water Police Court with a star on it, with the long roof of the police station in front of that. In the foreground is the Bridge Street tram yard, where alterations were made for a receiving station for the health department, so they could transport patients in ambulance tram cars out to the Coast Hospital for infectious diseases at Little Bay. In this later view, the police court has now appeared between the Water Police Court and the police station, and this court was soon pressed into service as an inoculation depot. They did not know what caused influenza, but the Department of Health manufactured a vaccine using samples obtained from sufferers at the quarantine station. Although it might not prevent infection, it appeared to reduce the severity of the illness and the risk of death. Known as the state vaccine, it was ready for use in late November, and the first public depots for free inoculation opened at the Water Police Court, Hyde Park Recruiting Depot, and the Newtown Town Hall, staffed by nurses and members of voluntary aid detachments, who were simply known as VADs. Inoculation was so popular that depots were established in suburbs and country towns, and the state vaccine had to be supplemented with supplies from the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. There was a widespread belief that the vaccine was good for treating other ailments, such as rheumatoid arthritis or sciatica. One woman who'd been inoculated several times even claimed to have partially recovered her hearing. By the end of the year, more than 83,000 people had already been vaccinated. When flu arrived in Sydney, there was again a rush for inoculation. Additional depots were open and the hours of the main ones extended. In the first week, nearly 200,000 people were inoculated. The day this photograph was taken of the long queue lined up to head into the police court at the Water Police complex, over 4,900 people were inoculated here at the comfortable rate of 300 arms per hour. As the caption, "Is there danger in the queue?" suggests, there was little social distancing. At Hyde Park, the position was even worse. In fact, the greatest number of people who turned up for inoculation on one day at any depot turned up here on the 29th of January, almost 10,000 people. By comparison, inside, it was an ocean of calm. Mask wearing was also brought into force. The government insists that the many shall not be placed in danger for the few. Everyone shall wear a mask. Those who are not doing so are not showing their independence. They are only showing their indifference for the lives of others, for the lives of the women and the helpless little children who cannot help themselves. Masks could be bought from shops or street vendors or homemade, often ingeniously customised for individual tastes. In this photograph, taken outside the Water Police Court veranda, a chap's buying a mask from a street vendor who's carrying what suspiciously looks like a bookie's bag. Masks were made in their thousands by the members of the Red Cross, who had been early adopters of the fashion. For the more fashionable, dainty fabrics in pretty shades were available to make dressy masks. The diversity of masks was noted by the Red Cross workers. The wire contraptions in use by the government servants were soon cast aside, and much ingenuity was shown in devising masks to suit individual tastes. Elaborate hood masks for use by doctors, nurses, and actual contacts with infected people. Others were labelled according to style: handkerchief mask, pouch mask, yashmak, etc. But ribald spirits in Red Cross headquarters soon adopted more expressive names for them: the dog's muzzle, nose bag, toothache bandage, and pig snout. And I'm not sure, but that woman in the centre there on the left may well be wearing a nose bag mark. According to the caption in this photo, the lady on the bottom left is wearing a typical lady's mask and veil, while the one on the right is wearing a type of yashmak. The compulsory wearing of masks in public was enforced by the police. However, not all obeyed this command. As you can see, those two young lads lounging against the wall to the left are not quite wearing their masks in the improved manner. A steady parade of offenders came before the magistrates with a range of excuses for not wearing their masks, to no avail. One man even claimed that his mask was invisible. Even Eileen Lee, the daughter of notorious sly grog queen and crime boss Kate Lee, couldn't escape being fined £1 or 7 days imprisonment for being on a tram without a mask. She was wearing hers under a chin, and that rather glamorous looking lady in the white is believed to be Eileen Lee. Like today, people flocked to the beach, where mask wearing was not rigorously enforced. Rules closing places of worship were relaxed to allow outdoor services, such as this one at the rear of St James Church in Queen's Square. People were seated from 2 to 3 feet apart and masks were worn. These apparently were found exceedingly awkward whilst singing. One measure I hope they don't repeat is the installation of inhalatoria, or inhalation chambers, which were set up in public places and businesses, with portable one used in private dwellings, and tram cars and railway carriages fitted up as mobile chambers. Steam generated by a boiler sprayed zinc sulfate towards the inhaler, and this was supposed to disinfect the throat. Although it was emphasised these chambers were a precaution against germs rather than a cure, and their effectiveness was questionable, the psychological value of inhalation was important, and an inhalatorium was set up in the Water Police complex in November and opened to the public in February. However, it was criticised by some experts for producing unsuitably large droplets. Inhalation didn't appear to yield encouraging results, and in fact, it probably did more harm than good, from the risk of spreading infection by crowding people together in a small chamber. It was discontinued about halfway through the epidemic. And this from New Zealand is an example of the type of portable device that you might be taken around to private homes. There were different forms of inhalation chambers, including the one that Kodak installed in their factory in Melbourne for their workers. You can just see on the upper right there, a group of workers lined up for their twice daily 4-minute treatment. This involved inserting their heads in the holes down either side of the chamber, and I doubt they were wiped down with disinfectant in between inhalations. Inhalation chambers were installed in department stores to both serve and entice customers, and to reassure customers that staff was treated daily. There was an emphasis placed on safety first while shopping. I find this ad from the Mudgee newspaper both ambitious and rather disturbing. They claim that our staff pass daily through the inhalation chamber, thus making them germ-proof for 6 hours. Of course, if you wanted to use one in your own home, there were portable devices that you could buy for yourself. The Department of Education building in Bridge Street became the headquarters of the Metropolitan Citizens Influenza Administrative Committee, which coordinated responses and application for food and financial relief, organised emergency hospitals, and distributed SOS cards to signal that help was needed. A fleet of cars and motorcycles with sidecars was provided as transport for nurses, doctors, and urgent supplies. Around 100 relief depots were set up under the committee's control, largely in town halls and public schools across Sydney and its suburbs, as community hubs coordinating local efforts and arranging home visits, the distribution of food, clothing, bedding and medicine, and care for unprotected children. They were largely staffed by volunteers, including many VADs, Red Cross members, and medical students, plus school teachers freed from their usual duties by the closure of schools. Fortunately, there was a widespread spirit of volunteering. There was already a well-oiled, ready-made volunteer army following the war, largely women, which swung back into action. These included two of the Swan sisters from Elizabeth Farm. Margaret, the headmistress at Parramatta Infant School, went out nursing stricken families and acted as a head of the relief depot at the town hall until illness struck her own home. Lil, the deputy headmistress of West Maitland Infant School, was a member of the local committee and was one of two women given responsibility for the care of children whose parents were affected. One of the families who availed themselves of the services of these depots was the Hughes family, who lived at number 58 Gloucester Street, The Rocks, Susanna Place. Fred Hughes later remembered going down to the health department building to obtain masks, but they did not protect the family, two-thirds of whom caught the flu. Eldest son Charlie, baby Iris, and mother Lena were all taken to hospital. They were close to death's door. Fred developed a milder case and he remained at home. Their meals were supplied by a nearby clinic. 70 years later, the impact was still clear in Fred's mind. And note the use of the term plague in that second quote. That's not really a mistake. It's a term that appears over and over again in oral histories that were recorded with people who were young during the pandemic. At the time, it was often referred to in the press as the influenza plague or simply the plague, with alarmist comparisons to the Black Death. The pandemic was so devastating that for many, it became mixed up in memory with the plague epidemic nearly 20 years earlier, which was another time of fear, panic, regulation, and media hysteria. This was particularly the case in the Rocks, where the bubonic plague and its aftermath had made such an impact. Although the Hughes family survived, Arthur Sherwood, who worked at Rouse Hill, was not so fortunate. Like many victims, he was a man of apparently strong constitution and in the prime of his life when he was struck down. He left behind a widow and 3 young children. In a kindly Christian act, Edward Stephen and Bessie Rouse allowed the family to continue living in a cottage at Rouse Hill rent-free. A year later, the community was still rallying around, holding fundraising evenings to benefit the bereaved family. The disease gradually spread to country districts, its progress tracked by newspaper reports and a series of proclamations made and revoked. The control of the epidemic in country districts was mainly left to local authorities. They established emergency hospitals wherever they could. Private houses, public schools, a police station, showgrounds, parish halls, even the Forbes jail and the courthouse at Young. At Bega, they've installed an emergency hospital at the then empty Presbyterian manse. And I confess I may have added this photo in of the volunteers there as much for the jaunty angle of those caps that those chaps are wearing. Influenza reached Nowra in the last week of June. A temporary hospital was set up in the public school, organised by the local branch of the Red Cross, who also provided food from their relief depot at the Methodist parsonage. The nursing staff included Helen McGregor, who had trained at the Coast Hospital. Helen was the daughter of Roderick McGregor and his wife, Mary Susan Nee Thorburn, who lived at Kintore, the cottage built for them next door to Marugal. In the 5 weeks that the hospital operated, 37 patients were cared for, 2 of whom died. By mid-August, Nowra was free of influenza and the school had reopened. A local doctor later commented that the country districts around Nowra were not invaded to any great extent, as the country people practically quarantined the town. By the end of September, the pandemic was over. life began to return to normal as the country started to count the cost, both human and financial, and consider the lessons learned for the future. At least 12,500 Australians had died, more than half of them in New South Wales. Although officially almost 22,000 cases were reported in New South Wales, it is estimated some 290,000 people in Sydney alone caught the disease. Now, I wanted to finish on a positive note and emphasise the importance of local community action. And with these images of the Kensington School of Arts depot, I've gone very local. These photographs were taken about 3 blocks from where I'm sitting in my kitchen. The blackboards list the nurses, cooks and others on the team, and there are notices for depot watchers after 10 p.m, the day patrol, night patrol, mounted patrol, sulkies, spring carts and drivers. And I noticed just last night that pony in the foreground near the sign actually has an SOS banner hanging from his brow band. This is a copy of an illuminated address which was presented by a grateful patient to those who had nursed him back to health and strength by the unremitting intention of the members of the local Kensington Voluntary Aid Detachment. This association, brought into existence by the necessities of war, has been called upon to extend its benevolent help to our civilian residents in the worldwide epidemic of influenza, and only those who have come under its influence can adequately understand its labours of love to all the community who needed its kindly aid. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I noticed in our comments, a lot of people are commenting on the fact the resonance with today is absolutely amazing. Yes. I did have a question for you. Were there particular groups in society that the flu impacted on more than others?
Yes, apart from, instead of afflicting the elderly, which was more common with influenza, it also particularly struck young men and also pregnant women those groups were rather nicely described as who we could least be spared to the country. It also had a big impact on Aboriginal communities when it entered there, killing up to half the population of those afflicted in Aboriginal communities. And in what might be a lockdown lesson, it also had a particularly bad effect on chronic alcoholics, apparently. So that might be a lesson to us all.
It's absolutely devastating. It was known as the Spanish flu, as well as, the other names that you mentioned during your talk. Can you give us a bit of an insight as to why it got that name?
It's called the and there's a lot of debate still about where it actually originated. I think the latest thinking is it maybe came out of military camps in Kansas in America and was taken then to the war front. But the best guess is say it likely emerged in either the United States or France. It was known as the Spanish flu, not because it originated there, but because Spain was neutral during the war. So its devastation and its impact was really widely reported. So that name sort of stuck, and poor Spain got blamed for something it really had no fault in.
I'll just have a look at some of the questions coming in. Now, Barbara would like to know, was the vaccine appropriate for everyone, for all ages?
Well, as it was all very experimental, but it seemed to be, it was very popular with children and women, as you saw some of those photographs. And that was noted very much in the official reports, and there didn't seem to be many adverse effects to it apart from the sore arm we've all had or a slight fever. It was so popular, one lady turned up at the depot with her dog and was very put out when they wouldn't vaccinate the dog, because she said that was the most likely thing she was going to catch flu from.
Well, there's a question here about country towns. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the response was in the country as opposed to the city?
Well, it was theoretically it was supposed to be in the same vein as the city, but it was under a different influenza committee, and it ended up being largely organised by the local authorities, and often very much on a volunteer basis, because there was a real shortage of nurses to send out to the places. So local committees would be formed to deal with it. Again, relying very much on the volunteers who'd come to the force so much during the war, very much, many of whom were women, and then the local councils and things like that. You can get a good idea from it, both from local newspapers, and the Royal Australian Historical Society actually did a project on the epidemic last year, but there is a report that was put together by the Department of Health, and it lists literally every town where it arrived and when it ended, and all the various venues that they used as influenza hospitals, and reports from local doctors on how it had impacted in that area or whether it had.
In your talk, you showed many of the Sydney Living Museum sites and the impact it had on the sites and the people who lived in them. You also showed the Hyde Park depot. Can you give me a bit more information about where that was? And
the Hyde Park recruiting depot, which you could see was a bit of a weatherboard construction, was located on the corner of Liverpool Streets and Elizabeth Streets. So I think it's sort of where Museum Station is now. It was there from 1918. There had been another recruiting depot in Hyde Park the previous year, which was actually a big tent at the entrance to Hyde Park in Queen Square. So I suppose that was the step up.
And Jackie would like to know, did people receive government financial assistance if they lost work?
Yes and no, again, theoretically. And there were those relief depots, and particularly the committee had the facility to give immediate aid for people that needed food relief or financial relief. But you start to get a parade of people coming through the courts who have lost their jobs because of the pandemic. And there was I think it was called the Epidemic Relief Act, put into place to provide financial assistance to businesses and people that had lost their livelihoods. But in what will surprise you, I can't remember the proportion, but it wasn't a huge amount of the applications that the government ended up paying.
We have had a question about whether somebody can revisit your presentation. We are recording all of the curatorial talk series, and you can find that on our website, Sydney Living Museums. Again, people are commenting on the glorious images and the photographs that you found. Whereabouts did you go to find all of these rich images?
It varies. A lot of them were obviously newspaper images, but the sequences, the aerials I showed, for example, looking down from the Chief Secretary's building across to Circular Quay from over the Water Police Court, and that lovely suite of images looking at the various relief depots. Most of them came from New South Wales State Archives and are actually on their Flickr page. And there's also some that I looked at the Randwick City Library. But I've ranged far and wide searching some of these images.
There's a question about mask wearing. Is there any evidence that people continued to wear their masks after the flu disappeared?
That's a very good question. I actually don't know whether anybody's ever really got into that. It was quite, as you can see, it was quite, like today, resisted by some people, and there were people that wore them under their chin or dangled them from their ears or said they didn't work or cut a slit in it so they could have a smoke. All the use, and particularly with men returned from the war who'd been gassed, there were issues with using it. But I don't think that they were used much later on, except in situations where you might have had another epidemic. And in fact, rules making you wear them outside were actually relaxed quite early on.
All right, we've got time for one last question. And Barbara was wondering, could you recommend a book on this topic? Is there any particular one that you came across that you found particularly useful?
It depends what aspect you're interested in. Robin Arrowsmith wrote a book, A Danger Greater Than War, quite some years ago now, which really looks at the epidemic in Australia, but there are a range of publications that look at, and a lot of journal articles too, that have analysed both the impact of the pandemic and the number of cases here, but that social side. And a lot more of the social side, which is what I was particularly interested in, how it impacted people and day-to-day life, has been done in journal articles. Again, the Royal Australian Historical Society actually has on their website part of the article that they wrote that gave you a sort of a broad overview of the pandemic, and it links to local case studies done by local historical societies. So I think there's one from up on the Tweed, for example, so it gives you that idea of how the local communities responded and dealt with the situation.
Thanks, Jane. So I want to invite you all to tune in this Thursday at 4 p.m. to discover some of the fascinating Olympics memorabilia that Sydney-siders have held on to, and share your own memories in an interactive discussion that celebrates collectors and Olympics nostalgia. That's part of our History Reflected series. Next Tuesday, we're moving our talk time to 4 o'clock, and you will be able to hear Dr. Carlin de Montfort discuss the fascinating life of the convict James Watford. Hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you.